3 weeks before my wedding, my mother raised her glass and told the table my sister would suit him better. My sister was already curled in his lap. She giggled. My father howled. For 34 years she'd flinched every time I laughed, as if the sound belonged to a ghost she'd buried. I set down my glass. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. By midnight I'd blocked every last one of them. 6 months. Silence. Then my fiancé drove to their house. Alone. Near midnight. He wouldn't say why. By 4 a.m. she was calling. 19 times. Not angry. Terrified. Please, she begged. What did he tell? Whatever she'd hidden my whole life was finally clawing free. I'm Bethany, 34. The woman on the other end of those 19 calls raised me, fed me, signed my report cards, and never once looked at me like I belonged to her. I didn't understand why until the night my fiancé came home holding the answer. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning is where she started lying. I grew up in a yellow house on Wexler Street, in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone and no one knew us. From the outside, we looked ordinary. A mother, a father, 2 daughters, a dog named Biscuit who died when I was 10. Church on Sundays, casseroles in the freezer. The kind of family a stranger would call nice. Inside that house there were 2 temperatures. There was the temperature for Vanessa, my younger sister. Warm, bright. The heat of a kitchen at Christmas. And there was the temperature for me. I learned it before I learned to read. It was the temperature of a woman setting your plate down a little too hard, of a hand that pats your sister's hair and stops an inch short of yours, of a mother who says goodnight to one daughter with a kiss and to the other with a nod. My mother's name is Marlene, and for as long as I can remember, she looked at me the way you'd look at a stain you couldn't scrub out. I don't want you to picture screaming. That's not how it worked. Marlene was quiet, controlled. She never hit me in anger. What she did was colder than that. She subtracted me. Slowly, carefully, from every warm thing in that house. When I was 6, I made her a card for her birthday. I drew a house with 2 little figures holding hands out front. I worked on it for 2 days. I remember the exact green crayon I used for the grass. I handed it to her at breakfast, my whole chest full of hope, and she looked at it for a second, said, "That's nice," and set it face down under her coffee cup. When she got up, the ring from the mug had bled through the paper. I found it in the trash that afternoon, on top of the eggshells. Vanessa's cards went on the refrigerator. Mine went under the coffee cup. I want to be fair to you, because I've spent a lot of my life trying to be fair to her. Marlene was not a monster in the way movies teach you. She volunteered at the food pantry. She nursed our neighbor through chemo. She could be gentle. I saw her be gentle 100 times. I just never saw her be gentle to me. And here is the thing that carved the deepest. I couldn't figure out what I'd done. Children always assume it's them. If your mother can't love you, the math your 5-year-old brain does is simple and merciless. There must be something wrong with me. Something rotten. Buried so deep even I can't see it. Why else would the person who's supposed to love you most look straight through you? That question moved into my chest when I was small, and it never left. It became the wound I built my whole life around. Am I someone who is fundamentally unlovable? Is that what she sees when she looks at me? I asked her once. I was maybe 9. I stood in the doorway of her sewing room and I said, "Mom, did I do something wrong?" She didn't turn around. She kept threading the needle. And she said in that flat, tired voice, "You don't have to do anything, Bethany. You just are what you are." I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. That sentence had a whole hidden country underneath it. She wasn't punishing me for something I did. She was punishing me for something I was. If you think a cold childhood is one big wound, you've never had one. It isn't one wound. It's 10,000 small ones, and each one teaches you a little more clearly where you stand. When I was 8, I saved up for 4 months to buy Marlene a scarf for Christmas. Real money, from raking the neighbor's leaves hidden in a sock. I wrapped it myself in newspaper because I didn't know where the real paper was. On Christmas morning, she opened it, said, "Oh," in a voice you'd use for a wrong number call, and set it aside. That afternoon, I saw it in the bag of things going to the church donation bin. Vanessa's gift to her that year was a mug from the drugstore. Marlene used that mug until it chipped. When I was 11, I made the district honor choir, one of 40 kids out of 2,000. There was a concert, a real one, at the community hall, and I had a solo, 8 bars, alone, under a light. I told them at dinner a week ahead. On the night, Vanessa had a stomachache. Not a fever. A stomachache. And Marlene decided the family couldn't possibly go out with poor Vanessa feeling poorly, and my father agreed. And so I rode my bike to the community hall in the cold and sang my 8 bars under the light to a room where the 2 seats they'd reserved sat empty. I could see them from the stage. 2 empty folding chairs with our name on a paper card. I didn't cry about it. I want you to understand that by then I already didn't cry about these things. I'd learned that crying only confirmed for Marlene that I was the dramatic one, the difficult one, the one who made everything about herself. So I sang my 8 bars to the empty chairs, and I rode my bike home in the dark. And when I came in, Marlene said, "How is your little thing?" And I said, "Fine." And that was the entire conversation. Here's the part I understand only now. It wasn't the choir she couldn't stand. It was the singing. Every time I opened my mouth to sing, something came out that she recognized. And it wasn't me. I know that now. I didn't know it then. I just learned, one empty chair at a time, that the safest thing to be in that house was quiet. My father, Gerald, was the laugh track. That's the kindest way I can put it. When Marlene said something cutting, Gerald chuckled, as if it were a joke, as if turning cruelty into comedy made it disappear. He wasn't the one holding the knife. He was the one who handed her the room to use it in. 34 years my father watched a child get frozen out at her own dinner table, and his contribution was to laugh so no one had to sit with the silence. Vanessa learned the temperatures too. Kids do. By the time she was 7, she knew that in our house, being cruel to me came with a reward. A smile from Mom. Well, she's not wrong. So Vanessa performed. She'd take the bigger slice and dare me to say something. She'd break my things and tell Mom I did it. And every time, the verdict came down the same way, before I even opened my mouth. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you need to understand the shape of the hole before you understand what finally filled it. Because there was one warm thing in my childhood. One. Her name was Nora, my grandmother, my mother's mother. Nora lived 40 minutes away, in a farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a garden that smelled like tomatoes and rain. And when I was in that house, I was a different child. Nora looked at me, really looked. She'd cup my face in her 2 dry hands and study me like I was something she'd been waiting her whole life to see. She kept my drawings, all of them. She had a drawer full. I didn't question it as a kid. I just knew that when Marlene dropped me off at Nora's, some tight thing in my shoulders let go. Nora would put on the radio and cook and hum this little tune under her breath, this low, rolling melody that I could never find anywhere else. I asked her once what song it was. She got quiet. Then she said, "Just something you're..." And she stopped. "Just an old song. Hush now and stir the pot." I noticed the stop. I was maybe 8. I filed it away with all the other things in that house that started and didn't finish. And I noticed one more thing, though it took me years to see it clearly. When Nora and Marlene were in the same room, something went wrong in the air. Marlene got sharp. Nora got careful. They spoke to each other in a code I couldn't crack, sentences with too much weight for their few words. Once I heard Marlene hiss, "You always did love her more," and slam a cabinet, and I assumed she meant me, that I'd done something to make my mother jealous of my own grandmother's affection. Even then, I made myself the guilty one. I was wrong about who her was, but I wouldn't learn that for decades. I did what a lot of us do. The second I could leave, I left. I got a scholarship, went to nursing school 2 states away, and I built a life with my own 2 hands, brick by brick, out of nothing anyone in that house ever gave me. I became a hospice nurse. I sit with people in the last rooms of their lives. I hold hands that families have already let go of. I'm good at it. I think I'm good at it precisely because I spent my whole childhood learning to love people who couldn't love me back, and to do it without needing anything in return. By 34, I had a small house I owned outright, a job that meant something, and a savings account nobody in my family knew about and none of them could touch. I want you to hold on to that last part. It matters more than it looks like right now. And I had Elliot. I met Elliot when I was 31. He builds things, cabinets, staircases, the bones of houses. He has sawdust in the creases of his hands that never fully washes out, and a way of going quiet before he says something that turns out to matter. He is the least dramatic person I have ever loved. When something breaks, he doesn't panic. He looks at it for a long moment, and then he fixes it. That's just who he is. The first time I brought him home to meet my family, I watched him watch them. I saw him clock the 2 temperatures in about 20 minutes. In the car afterward, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Your grandmother's the only one in that house who looks at you." He wasn't asking. He'd seen it too. Elliot loved Nora, and Nora, in the last years of her life, loved Elliot in a way that I didn't fully understand until much later. She'd pull him aside. They'd talk on the porch while I did dishes. I thought it was sweet. An old woman and the young man marrying her granddaughter. I had no idea what they were really building out there, because there was a promise being made on that porch. A promise I wasn't allowed to hear yet. Elliot proposed in December, on a Tuesday. No big production, just the 2 of us and a ring he'd been carrying for a month. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We set a date for late January. Small, fast, us. And against every instinct I'd earned over 34 years, some soft, stupid, hopeful part of me thought maybe this was the thing that would finally thaw them. Maybe a wedding, maybe now. So when my mother called, she never called, and invited us to a family dinner 3 weeks before the wedding, to celebrate, I let myself believe it. I should have known better. I did know better. I went anyway. Before I tell you what happened at that table, and it's worse than the version you already heard, let me say one thing to you, wherever you're listening from tonight. If you grew up being the child who got the nod instead of the kiss, you already know the specific weight of walking back into a room like that with hope in your hands. You know how heavy hope is when you've been burned for carrying it before. If this is already sitting in your chest, do me a favor. Take 1 second and like this video and subscribe so it can find the other people who need to hear it tonight. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one, and I like knowing I'm not talking into an empty room. Now, let me take you into that dinner, because that's the night the quiet finally got loud. The house on Wexler Street still smelled like my childhood. Lemon polish and pot roast and something underneath it I never had a name for. Marlene opened the door in her good blouse, the navy one, and she smiled at Elliot like he was the guest of honor. She barely glanced at me. "You made it," she said. To him, not to me. I told myself it was fine. I'd driven 2 hours with a bottle of wine I couldn't afford and a heart I'd talked into hoping I could survive 1 dinner. Vanessa was already there. My sister is beautiful in the loud way, the way that takes up a room and dares it to look away. She'd done something new with her hair. She hugged Elliot a beat too long and said, "So, This is the famous fiancé. And I watched her decide, right there in the entryway, that she wanted the room to be about her. We sat down. The good china. The candles Marlene only lit for company. For a little while, it was almost normal. Gerald asked Elliot about the cabinet business, and Elliot answered in his slow, steady way, and I let the warmth of the candles trick me into thinking maybe. Then Marlene poured the wine, and it started. You know, she said, swirling her glass, looking at Elliot. Vanessa was always the one we thought would marry first. She's just got that quality. Men notice her, Elliot said. Bethany's the one I noticed. Marlene smiled like he'd said something naive. Of course, of course. And she turned to my sister. Vanessa, don't slouch. That was round one. I know the choreography. A little jab, dressed as a compliment to someone else. I kept my hands in my lap and my face still. I've had 34 years of practice keeping my face still. Round two came with the salad. Vanessa got up to help, which in our family meant to perform. She circled the table and stopped behind Elliot's chair and put her hands on his shoulders like she owned them. You've got such good posture, she said, low, and laughed. Bethany always did pick the responsible ones. So safe, I said evenly. Vanessa. Marlene said, Oh, let her be. She's just being friendly. And then, to Elliot, warmly, like they were old conspirators. You'll have to forgive us. We're a close family. Close. In that house, that word was a weapon. I looked at Gerald. My father met my eyes for half a second. And then he looked at his plate and he did what he always does. He chuckled. Just a little. Just enough to tell the room that nothing serious was happening here. Nothing to see. Only a family being close. Here's what I want you to understand, because it's the whole engine of that night. None of it was loud yet. If you'd filmed it, you could have edited it to look like a warm family dinner. That's the trick of a house like mine. The cruelty lives in the space between the words, in the tone, in who gets looked at and who gets looked past. For years that made me doubt my own memory. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I imagined it. I did not imagine what came next. Vanessa didn't go back to her seat. She perched herself on the arm of Elliot's chair. Then, laughing, she slid down onto his knee, the way you'd sit on the lap of a boyfriend, an old lover, a man who was yours. Elliot went rigid. He put a hand up to move her and she caught his wrist and squealed, Oh, relax, we're family now, and looked straight at me while she said it. And my mother raised her glass. You know, she said to the whole table in the pleasant voice she used for church, I've always thought your sister would suit him better. The candles kept burning. The pot roast kept steaming. And my father laughed. Out loud this time. A real laugh. Delighted, like a man watching his favorite show. Vanessa laughed with him, still on Elliot's knee, and for one long second the two people who raised me sat in the warm light of their good china and laughed at the idea of my sister taking the one good thing I'd built for myself. I want to tell you, I stood up and burned the house down with a sentence. I didn't. Something in me went very quiet and very clear, the way a room goes quiet right after glass breaks. I set my glass down on the tablecloth. I looked at my mother and I said, in a voice I didn't have to raise, Say that again. The laughter stopped. Marlene's smile flickered. Bethany, don't be dramatic. You raised a glass at my engagement dinner, I said, and told my fiancé he should marry my sister. So say it again. To my face. Slowly. For a moment I thought I saw it. The thing I'd spent my life trying to read in her. Not guilt. Something older and more frightened than guilt. Her eyes moved over my face, and she flinched. The same flinch I'd seen 1,000 times, the one I never understood. The tiny recoil she made whenever she really looked at me. Then she recovered, and she said the thing that ended us. You were never really mine anyway, she said. Quiet. Almost tired. I don't know why I expected you to understand a joke. "You were never really mine." I heard it as cruelty. The cruelest thing she'd ever said, and she'd said a lot. I didn't hear it as a fact. I couldn't have. I didn't have the key yet. Elliot stood up so fast Vanessa nearly fell off his knee. He didn't shout. He put his napkin on the table and he looked at my mother for a long moment, and something passed over his face that I didn't recognize then. Not surprise. Recognition. Like a man watching a thing happen that he'd been warned would happen. "We're leaving," he said. To me. Only to me. I stood. My hands were steady. That's the part that scared me later. How steady they were. I looked around that table one last time, at my father who couldn't stop half smiling, at my sister rearranging her dress, at my mother with her wine still raised, and I understood something with a calm that felt almost like relief. They were never going to change. The hope I'd carried in for 2 hours was the same hope I'd carried in at 6 and 9 and 19, and it had been wrong every single time. "Thank you for dinner," I said, and we left. In the car, I did the only thing left to do. I took out my phone and I blocked them. My mother, my father, my sister. One by one, in the dark, while the heater ticked and Elliot drove and the town slid past the windows. Block. 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 34 years. Closed with my thumb. I waited to cry. I didn't. What I felt instead was the strangest thing. A door I'd been holding open my whole life, leaning my whole weight against it, finally swinging shut. And behind it, quiet. Just quiet. I called the venue the next morning and postponed the wedding. Not because I loved Elliot less, because I could not stand up in a white dress and pretend to be a woman with a family. 3 weeks after that family raised a glass to my replacement. Elliot didn't argue. He held my hand across the kitchen table and said, "Whenever you're ready, or never. I'm not going anywhere." And I believed him, because he'd never once given me a reason not to. But here's the thing I noticed in the weeks after. The thing that snagged in me like a splinter I couldn't find. Elliot wasn't surprised. Angry, yes, but not surprised. When I raged about my mother, he got quiet in a specific way, a careful way, the way Nora used to get quiet. When I said, "I just don't understand why she hates me," he didn't say what everyone else says. He didn't say she doesn't hate you, she's just difficult. He looked at his hands and he said, "There are things about your family you don't know yet." And when I asked him what he meant, he said, "It's not mine to tell. Not yet. Not yet." Nora used to say that too. I let it go. I had grief to get through and a life to hold together. I didn't push. I've thought about that 100 times since, how close the truth stood to me for those 6 months, close enough to touch, wearing the face of the man I loved, and I walked past it because I was too tired to ask one more question of one more person I trusted. Pause the story for a second. Before I tell you what my grandmother left behind, I want you to guess. What do you think Elliot knew? What did a quiet man who builds staircases know about my mother that he'd promised not to say? Tell me your theory in the comments before I show you. Most people guess the obvious thing. Almost nobody guesses the truth. Because to understand what was in that house, I have to take you back 8 months earlier, to the coldest morning of my life. The morning we buried Nora. Nora had been slipping for 2 years by then. First the names, then the days of the week, then whole afternoons. We moved her into a memory care place called Fairview when the farmhouse got too big for what was left of her, and I visited every week I could, driving the 40 minutes with a thermos of the coffee she liked, sitting with her on the good days and just holding her hand on the bad ones. Here's a strange, hard thing about memory going. It doesn't take everything at the same rate. Nora forgot my name a year before she died. But she never once forgot to look at me the way she always had, like I was someone she'd been waiting for. She'd hold my face in those 2 dry hands and her eyes would fill and she'd say, "There you are, there you are." Even when she couldn't find Bethany, she could always find that. And near the end, she started singing the tune again, the one from her kitchen, the low, rolling one I could never place. She'd hum it while she looked out the window, and sometimes she'd catch my hand and pat it in time, and once, this is the part that haunts me now. Once she looked right at me, clear as a bell, and she sang a whole line of it out loud, words I'd never heard. "Hush now, little fish, the river runs wide." Then she smiled and the clarity went out like a match, and she asked me if I was the new nurse. I wrote the line down in my phone that night. "Hush now, little fish, the river runs wide." I told myself I'd find the song someday. I never could. It isn't on any record. I've searched. It exists in exactly one place in the world, and I didn't know yet where that place was, or who taught it to her, or why my mother's face went white the one time I hummed it in her kitchen as a girl, and she told me to stop that. Stop that right now. Nora died in May, on a Tuesday, in her sleep. Fairview called me first. I don't know why that mattered so much to me, but it did. They called me first. The funeral was a study in my family. Marlene wore black and accepted condolences like a queen at a state function. Vanessa cried prettily in the front row. Gerald shook hands, and I sat off to the side, the way I always sat, and I said goodbye to the only person in my blood who ever made me feel like a person, and I did it mostly alone. After the service, back at the farmhouse, Marlene did something I didn't understand at the time. She took the box. Nora kept a cedar box on the top shelf of her bedroom closet. I'd seen it my whole life and never once seen it open. It was about the size of a bread loaf, dark wood gone soft and pale at the corners from handling, with a small brass latch and a keyhole. As a child, I asked her what was in it, and she said, "Everything that matters," and changed the subject. It was the one thing in that house that was always, quietly, off limits. At the farmhouse after the funeral, I watched my mother go straight up the stairs, straight to that closet, and come down with the cedar box held against her chest with both arms. Not the jewelry, not the good silver, not the deed to the farm, the box. She put it in her car before the casseroles were even uncovered, and when I said, "Mom, what's in Nana's box?" she turned to me with an expression I'd never seen on her before. It wasn't grief, it was fear. "Nothing that concerns you," she said, and shut the car door. I let it go. Of course I let it go. My grandmother was 3 hours in the ground, and I did not have it in me to fight my mother over a wooden box, but it lodged in me, the way her arms wrapped around it, the way she'd gone up those stairs like she'd been planning the trip for weeks. What I got instead, what Marlene let me have, tossed to me almost as an afterthought as I was leaving, was Nora's Bible. A worn old King James with a cracked leather cover and a rubber band holding it together. "Here," my mother said. "She'd want you to have something religious. God knows you need it." Even at a funeral, she couldn't hand me a gift without a blade in it. I took the Bible home and I set it on my nightstand, and I didn't open it for 3 weeks. Grief is like that. Some doors you can't make yourself walk through until you can. When I finally did open it, a photograph fell out. It slid from between the thin pages and landed face up on my quilt, and I picked it up with 2 fingers, and my whole body went still. It was a photo of a baby, maybe 6 months old, fat-cheeked, laughing, one hand reaching up, and the baby was being held by a woman. But the woman's face was gone. Someone had torn the photograph, carefully, along a curve, removing the top third where her head would have been. What was left was a body in a yellow summer dress, arms wrapped around a laughing baby, and a warm blur of a garden behind them. I turned it over. On the back, in Nora's slanted, careful hand, 4 words in faded blue ink. "My girls, Spring 1992. Spring 1992. I was born in March of 1992. I sat on my bed and I looked at that photo for a very long time. My girls. Plural. I told myself the faceless woman was Marlene. Of course it was Marlene. Who else holds a baby in the spring of 1992 and gets called, by Nora, one of my girls? It had to be my mother. The tear was probably just old damage, I told myself, the corner catching on something over the years. But I couldn't make the story fit, and I didn't know why. The dress was wrong. Marlene never in her life wore a soft yellow sundress. She wore navy and gray and disapproval. And the arms in that photo were wrapped around that baby like the baby was the best thing that had ever happened. I had 34 years of evidence about how my mother held me, and it did not look like that. Nothing about my mother had ever looked like that. I want you to hold that torn photograph in your mind. A laughing baby. A woman in yellow with no face. My girls. Spring 1992. Because that photo is the whole story, and I was staring right at it, and I couldn't read it. I put it back in the Bible. I told myself I'd ask Marlene about it someday. Then the engagement dinner happened, and I blocked her number, and someday became never. And the faceless woman in the yellow dress stayed faceless. There was one more thing I didn't know that spring, and it's the thing that changes everything. So I'm going to tell it to you now, even though I didn't learn it until much later. That torn photograph was not the only copy. There was another one. Whole. Uncut. A woman's face and all. And it was sitting in the dark. In a cedar box. In my mother's closet. 90 miles away. In the hands of the one person on earth determined that I would never, ever see it. Elliot knew about the box. That's the part that took my breath when I finally understood it. All through those 6 months of silence, while I grieved my grandmother and mourned a family and slowly, carefully rebuilt my quiet life, the man sleeping beside me knew exactly what my mother was hiding, and where, and why. He knew because Nora told him, on that porch. In those careful conversations I thought were sweet, he'd made her a promise. And Elliot doesn't break promises. It's the truest thing about him. It's the thing that was about to drive him 90 miles in the dark to the house of a woman who despised us both. Let me tell you what happened the night the phone rang. By July, 6 months of silence had done something I didn't expect. It had healed me a little. That surprised me. I thought cutting off my family would feel like an amputation, a permanent ache where the limb used to be. And there was ache. But there was also, for the first time in my life, a house with only one temperature in it. Warm. Just warm. All the way through. Elliot and I fell into a good rhythm. He'd come home smelling like cedar and I'd have dinner going, and we'd sit on the back step while the light went gold and long, and neither of us would say much, and it would be enough. I started laughing more. I noticed it because it felt unfamiliar in my own chest, like a muscle I'd never used. And I noticed that when I laughed, Elliot would look at me with something soft and sad in his face, and once he said, so quietly I almost missed it, "You've got the best laugh. You should have been allowed to keep it." I didn't know what he meant. Should have been allowed. Who takes a laugh away from a child? I filed it with all the other unfinished sentences. My whole life was a house of unfinished sentences, and I'd finally stopped trying to end them. Something else happened in those 6 months, and I only understand now why it mattered so much to me at the time. I had a patient that spring. I'll call her Edith, because that's close enough and she deserves her privacy even now. She was 86 and dying of the slow, tired kind of heart failure, and she had one daughter who lived 2 hours away and never came. For weeks I sat with Edith in the afternoons, and she talked, the way the dying do, in loops that circle closer and closer to the one thing. And her one thing was the daughter. I said something to her. Edith told me one afternoon, her hand light as paper in mine. 20 years ago. A cruel thing, about her husband. I was wrong. I knew I was wrong the second I said it. She looked at the window. I've spent 20 years being too proud to call. And now I'm going to die too proud, and she's going to spend the rest of her life the way I've spent these 20 years. Both of us, alone, over one sentence. I asked her gently why she didn't call now. Because, she said, if I call and she doesn't answer, then I'll know. And I'd rather die not knowing than die knowing. I drove home that night and I sat in my driveway for a long time. Because I was, in those months, the daughter who didn't answer. Somewhere out there was my own mother's version of Edith, and I'd blocked her number, and I felt not 1 ounce of guilt about it, and I kept waiting for the guilt to arrive, and it never did. And I couldn't tell, sitting in that driveway, whether that made me healed or whether it made me exactly like the granite woman who raised me. Edith died on a Sunday. The daughter came the next week to clear the room, and I met her in the hallway, and she was hollow-eyed and shaking, and she said, "Did she, at the end, did she say anything about me?" And I got to tell her the truth, which was that her mother talked about her every single day. The daughter broke apart right there in the hall. 20 years, collapsed into one hallway. I have thought about that woman 100 times since that gray July morning, because here is the thing I learned, and I want to be careful how I say it, because it isn't simple. Some estrangements are a wound you should heal, and some are a boundary that's keeping you alive. The trick, the whole brutal trick of it, is telling which one you're standing inside of. Edith's was a wound. She let pride wall her off from a daughter who'd have come running. Mine was not a wound. Mine was a wall I'd built around a fire to keep it from taking the rest of the house. I just didn't have the proof of that yet. I didn't have the letter. I was going on faith, on the plain animal fact that my body felt safer with those numbers blocked, and I was hoping, the way you hope in the dark, that the safety I felt was wisdom and not just another kind of coldness inherited from Marlene. The letter, when it finally came, would tell me which one it was. It would tell me I'd been right to run, but I didn't know that yet. That Thursday in mid-July, I still half believed I might be the villain of my own story. Then, on that Thursday in mid-July, Elliot got a phone call that ended everything gentle. We were doing dishes. His phone buzzed on the counter and he glanced at it, and I watched his whole body change. He set down the plate. He picked up the phone and walked into the other room, which he never does, and when he came back 20 minutes later, his face had gone to a place I'd only seen once before. At that dinner table, standing up so fast Vanessa nearly fell. "Who is that?" I asked. "An old friend of your grandmother's," he said. "Dottie, from Fairview." I hadn't heard that name in a year. Dottie was the woman 2 doors down from Nora at the memory care home, one of the few residents still sharp, the kind of tough old bird who knew everything about everyone. She and Nora had been thick as thieves at the end. "What did she want?" I asked. And Elliot did the thing he does before he says something that matters. He went quiet. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him standing at the edge of something, deciding whether to jump. "Bethany," he said, "there's something I promised your grandmother I would do, and the time to do it is now, or it's never." He put his hands on my shoulders. "I need you to trust me tonight. I need you to trust me even though I can't explain it yet. Can you do that?" Every instinct I'd built over 34 years said no, trust nobody, especially not the ones who ask you to. But this was Elliot, who had never once lied to me, who had stood up at that table when my own father laughed. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To get something that belongs to you," he said. "Something they've kept from you. That's all I can tell you right now, and I'm sorry, and I love you, and I'll be home by morning." "Elliot," my voice caught, "are you going to my parents?" He didn't answer, which was an answer. "Please don't," I said. "Whatever it is, it's not worth walking back into that house. Let it go. I already did." He cupped my face in his 2 rough hands, and for one dizzying second he looked exactly like Nora used to, holding my face like it was something precious. And he said, "This is the one thing I can't let go," because she couldn't. And she made me promise I wouldn't either. Then he got in his truck and he drove into the dark, 90 miles, alone. And he left me standing in the driveway with my arms wrapped around myself, not knowing that the man I loved was on his way to pry open the coffin of a secret my mother had guarded for 29 years. I didn't sleep. I sat up in the kitchen with the lights on and my phone in my hand, and I waited. The first call came at 3:52 in the morning. Unknown number. I let it ring out. It came again at 3:54. Again at 3:56. I'd blocked my mother's cell in January, but this wasn't her cell. It was the house line on Wexler Street, the landline that had hung on the kitchen wall my entire childhood, the one number I hadn't thought to block because who calls a landline anymore? By the fifth call, I answered it, and I will never, as long as I live, forget the sound of my mother's voice. Marlene did not have a voice that broke. In 34 years, I had never heard her cry. She was granite. But the woman on that line was in pieces. Bethany, Bethany, please, please pick up, please. She was already talking before she knew I was there. Then she heard me breathe, and she gasped. Oh, thank God. Bethany. Is he there? Is Elliot there with you? No, I said. A sound came out of her that I'd never heard. A kind of moan. What did he tell you? Bethany? Whatever he told you? Whatever's in that? Please, you have to let me explain. You have to let me be the one to— Mom. My own voice was very calm. It scared me, how calm. What are you talking about? And she said the thing. The thing that turned the key in a lock I didn't know I'd been standing in front of my whole life. Please, she sobbed. Don't let him read it to you. Not like this. Not from a stranger. Please. What did he tell you? 19 times she called that night. I have the log. 19. Not one of them was angry. Every single one was afraid. And I sat in my bright kitchen at 4 in the morning with the phone in my hand and a cold certainty spreading through my chest because a woman who never in her life said please was saying it now like a prayer. And you do not beg like that over a wooden box unless the box has your whole life inside it. Headlights swung into the driveway at 5:40. I was at the door before he turned the engine off. Elliot climbed out of the truck slowly, like a man who'd been driving through something heavier than distance. And in his arms, held against his chest with both hands, exactly the way my mother had carried it out of the farmhouse 8 months before, was Nora's cedar box. He stood in the gray morning light and he looked at me, and his eyes were red, and he said the words I'd waited 34 years to hear without ever knowing I was waiting. Bethany, he said. Your mother lied to you about who you are. And your grandmother spent her last clear afternoon making me promise you'd find out the truth before you died, not knowing you were loved. He held out the box. It's yours, he said. It was always yours. Everything in here is yours. I didn't take it. I couldn't. I stood in the doorway with my heart going like a fist on a door, and I said, Tell me what happened. All of it. Before I open anything, tell me exactly what happened tonight. So he did. We sat at the kitchen table with the box between us, unopened, and Elliot told me about the drive. He told me about Dottie's call, how Marlene had been up at the farmhouse for 2 weeks, clearing it out to put on the market, and how she'd told the estate agent, in front of Dottie who'd come to collect some of Nora's things for the residents, that she was finally going to burn the rest of it and be done. Dottie knew what the rest of it meant, because Nora, in her clear hours at Fairview, had told Dottie the same thing she'd told Elliot. And Dottie, 81 years old and afraid of nobody, had picked up the phone. He told me he drove straight there and knocked on the door on Wexler Street a little after 1 in the morning. My father answered. Your dad knew why I was there the second he saw my face, Elliot said. He didn't even ask. He just stood there in the doorway in his robe, and he looked about 100 years old, and he said, She's asleep. Don't wake her. And I said, Gerald, I need the box. And your father? Elliot stopped. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle. Your father started crying, right there on the porch. he said. I told her 29 years ago this would come out. I told her. And then he went inside, and he came back with it, and he put it in my hands, and he said, "Tell Bethany." Elliot's voice cracked. He said, "Tell Bethany, I'm sorry I laughed. I've been sorry for 29 years, and I laughed anyway." I put my hand over my mouth. I don't have a lot of soft feeling left for my father, but that one got under my ribs. "Then your mother came down," Elliot said, and his jaw went tight. "And she was not sorry. She saw the box in my arms and she came at me across that living room like she'd take my eyes out. She was screaming that I had no right, that it was hers, that she'd earned it, that I didn't understand what it cost her. She tried to grab it. Your father held her back. And I stood in the doorway, and I told her the only thing I came to say. He looked at me. I told her, tomorrow morning I'm going to read Bethany every word Nora wrote her. So if there's anything you want her to hear from you first, you'd better find the courage you've never had. Because after tomorrow, she gets the truth, and she gets to decide what she does with it. Not you." That was the sentence. That was the sentence that put 19 calls on my phone before dawn. My mother spent that night not in fury but in free fall, because for the first time in 29 years, the thing she'd buried was walking out her own front door in the arms of a man she couldn't manipulate. And there was nothing she could do to stop it reaching me. I looked at the box on my table, the soft, pale corners, the little brass latch. "Everything that matters," Nora had said. And here is where I have to be honest with you, because this is the part nobody tells you about finding out the truth. I didn't want to open it. For one long, cowardly minute, I wanted Elliot to take that box back out to the truck and drive it into a lake. Because I had spent 34 years believing there was something wrong with me, something so fundamental that my own mother couldn't love me. And I had finally, at 34, built a life where that question could almost sleep. And I understood, sitting there, that whatever was in that box was going to wake it up. It was going to answer the question I'd been asking since I was 6, and I was terrified the answer would be the one I'd always feared, that I'd open it and find proof. Proof that I really was the thing she saw. "I can't," I whispered. "Elliot, what if it's bad? What if it tells me why? What if there's a reason?" He took my hands across the table. "Bethany," he said. "I read the letter. Your grandmother let me read it, that day at Fairview, so I'd know it was worth a promise. I've carried what's in this box for 2 years. His eyes filled. "It is not what you're afraid of. It is the opposite of what you're afraid of. You have spent your whole life with the story upside down. Let me help you turn it over." And that was the exact moment headlights swung into my driveway for the second time that morning. I knew that car. I'd know it anywhere. A silver sedan backing crooked into my drive, one wheel up on the grass. My mother had driven 90 miles in the dark, in her nightgown and a coat thrown over it, to reach the box before I could. She was out of the car before it finished rolling. She came up my walk with her gray hair loose and wild around her face, a woman I had never once seen out of control, and she pounded on my door with the flat of her hand, and she screamed my name into the gray morning like she was drowning. "Bethany, Bethany, don't open it. Let me explain, please God, let me explain it first." I stood up from the table. Elliot rose with me, and I looked at that unopened box, and I looked at the door shaking under my mother's fists, and I felt something turn over in me that I'd been waiting my whole life to feel. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was done being afraid in that woman's weather. I walked to the door and I opened it. My mother nearly fell into the room. She caught herself on the frame, breathing hard, and up close she looked wrecked. Her face blotched, her eyes swollen, her hands shaking. I had spent my whole life waiting for her to look at me with feeling. Any feeling. And here it finally was. And it was terror. "Give it to me," she said. "The box. Give it to me and I'll explain everything, I promise. Just not from a piece of paper." Let me tell you myself. Come in, I said. Calm. Sit down. She wasn't expecting calm. It threw her. She came in on unsteady legs, and she saw the cedar box on my kitchen table, and she made a sound and lunged for it, and Elliot stepped between her and the table. Not roughly, just a wall, and she stopped. Sit down, Mom, I said again. She sat. She perched on the edge of my kitchen chair like it might buck her off, and she started talking fast, the way people talk when they're trying to get their version out before the truth can. You have to understand the position I was in, she said. You have no idea what I gave up, what I took on. I fed you. I clothed you. I sat up with you when you were sick. I did everything a mother does, and I never asked for a word of thanks. Why does Nana's box scare you? I asked. I gave you a home when I didn't have to. I gave you my name, Mom. I sat down across from her. You drove 90 miles in your nightgown, just tell me. Why are you afraid of what's in the box? And my mother, cornered, did the thing that cornered animals do. She went for the softest part of me, the part she'd spent 34 years mapping. Because it's lies, she hissed. Whatever Nora wrote, it's a sick old woman's fantasy. She never saw you clearly. She never saw any of it clearly. Her voice dropped and got cruel and got quiet. You want the truth, Bethany? Here's the truth. Nobody wanted you. Not the way you think. You were handed off. You were a problem to be solved. So don't you sit there and open that box like it's going to hand you a fairy tale. Because I am the only one who ever actually stayed. There it was. The oldest weapon in the house, sharpened to a point and driven straight into the wound. Nobody wanted you. And for one terrible second it worked. I felt the 6-year-old in me buckle. I felt the whole scaffolding of my life shake, because this was the thing I had always, secretly, most feared. That if I ever dug up the root of why my mother couldn't love me, I'd find that no one else could either. That the coldness wasn't a mistake. That it was a verdict. And everyone had signed it. I looked at the box. I could feel myself starting to believe her. That's how good she was. 30 years of practice. And then Elliot, very quietly, from where he stood by the table, said one thing. Bethany, ask her the woman's name. I looked up. What? The woman in the yellow dress, he said. The photo in Nora's Bible. The one with the torn corner. Ask your mother whose face got torn out, and watch what she does. My mother went white. I turned to her. Mom, I said slowly. There's a photo. A baby and a woman in a yellow dress, and the woman's face is torn away. On the back it says, My Girls, Spring 1992, in Nana's writing. I watched her the way I've learned to watch dying people for the truth their words won't say. Whose face did you tear out? She didn't answer, but her hand came up to her mouth, and her eyes filled. And 34 years of granite cracked right down the middle in front of me. You kept a copy, she whispered, to no one. That woman. She kept a copy in the Bible. Whose face, Mom? Don't, she said. Please. If I tell you, you'll love her instead of me. You'll love a dead woman instead of the one who stayed. That's what you'll do. That's what everyone always... She stopped. Her whole face collapsed. That's what I could never... And she couldn't finish it. Another unfinished sentence. My whole life. Unfinished sentences. But this time I understood that the person who couldn't finish them wasn't protecting me. She was protecting herself. I'm going to open the box now, I said. You can stay and be part of the truth. Or you can go. But you don't get to keep it from me anymore. That's over. She didn't move. She sat there with her hand over her mouth, shaking, and I reached across my own kitchen table, and I unlatched my grandmother's cedar box, and I lifted the lid. It smelled like Nora. That was the first thing. Cedar and dried lavender and the faint ghost of her hand cream, 30 years of it soaked into the wood. I had to close my eyes for a second. Then I opened them, and I looked at what my mother had driven 90 miles in her nightgown to keep from me. On top was a photograph. I knew it before I fully saw it. It was the same photo, the same laughing baby, the same yellow summer dress, the same warm blur of garden. Except this one was whole. Nobody had torn the top third away. The woman had a face, and the face was mine. Not similar to mine. Mine. The same wide-set eyes. The same crooked left eyebrow I'd hated in every school picture. The same smile that goes up higher on one side. A young woman, maybe 23, holding a baby up to the summer light and laughing at it with her whole open face. And if you'd told me it was a photo of me holding my own child, I would have believed you. But it wasn't me. I was the baby. "Who is this?" I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. My mother made a small broken sound and didn't answer. Under the photo was a document folded in thirds, soft at the creases. I opened it. A birth certificate, State of Ohio. And I read it the way you read something in a dream, the words arriving one at a time from very far away. Child, Bethany Colleen. Date of birth, March 1992. Mother, Colleen Ann Marsh. Colleen. I knew that name. It lived in the far back of my childhood, in the place where the unfinished sentences went. Colleen was a name the adults in my family said the way you'd touch a bruise. Quickly, and then not again. Aunt Colleen, who died. The one there were no pictures of. The one Nora's eyes went soft and wet over when she thought no one was watching. I'd asked about her exactly once, when I was small, and Marlene had said, "She's gone. We don't talk about her," in a voice that closed the subject like a coffin lid. Colleen Ann Marsh, mother. My mother's little sister was my mother. I set the certificate down very carefully, the way you set down something that might go off. The kitchen was completely silent except for my mother's breathing, ragged and fast, and I looked across the table at the woman whose name I'd carried my whole life, and I said the only thing my whole body could form. "You're not my mother. I raised you," she whispered. "You're my aunt. I raised you." She was crying now, openly, 34 years of granite gone to water. "I fed you. I stayed." Colleen, she'd have wanted, "Don't," I said, and something in my voice stopped her cold. "Don't you say her name like you loved her. You tore her face out of a photograph. You made me stop humming her song. You spent 29 years looking at me like I was a stain, and now I know why. Because every time you looked at me, you saw her. And under the certificate, at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a linen handkerchief, was a sealed envelope. Cream paper gone soft with age, and across the front, in my grandmother's slanted, careful hand, the words that finally ended all the unfinished sentences of my life. "To my Bethany, to be opened when you are ready for the truth, because you were always, always wanted." Nana, my hands were shaking now. I picked it up. And my mother lunged one last time, half rising out of the chair, her hand out. "Bethany, please, let me be the one. Please don't let her—" "Sit down," I said. She sat. I broke the seal, and I unfolded my grandmother's letter, and in the gray light of that July morning, with the woman who'd raised me weeping across the table and the man who'd kept the promise standing quiet at my side, I read it out loud. All of it. Every word. "My dearest Bethany, if you are reading this, then either I found the courage before I died to hand it to you myself, or more likely, I did not. And someone kept a promise for me. Either way, you are holding the truth at last, and I am so sorry it took so long to reach you. Some of that is my fault. I am going to tell you the whole of it, and you can decide what to do with an old woman who loved you and still got it wrong. You are not Marlene's daughter. You are her sister's daughter. Your mother was my Colleen, my youngest, and God forgive me, my favorite, because that word is the seed of this whole sad harvest, and I owe it to you to say it plain. Colleen was light. That's the only word. She came into the world laughing and she went out of it too soon, and in between she lit up every room she stood in. She got pregnant at 23, and she would not say by whom, and I did not press her, because she wanted you so badly it frightened me. She raised you herself in a little apartment over the hardware store on Main. She sang to you every single night, an old river song her father used to sing, one you won't find anywhere else in this world. Hush now, little fish. The river runs wide. You used to fall asleep with your fist around her finger. You laughed exactly like her. You still do. I have heard it. When you were 5, Colleen died. It was sudden. A bleed in her brain. No warning. Gone before the ambulance reached the hospital. One Tuesday she was singing you to sleep, and the next she was not anywhere at all. I was already old, and my hands were already shaking, and I could not raise a 5-year-old alone. So I asked Marlene. And here is where the fault becomes mine, Bethany, and I need you to hear it, because you have spent your life believing something was wrong with you, and I am going to spend this letter proving that nothing ever was. I loved Colleen more. Not more than you. Never more than you. But more than Marlene. When they were girls. And I let it show. And children see everything. Marlene grew up in her little sister's light and felt like the shadow it cast. She was the good one. The responsible one. The one who stayed. And none of it ever got her what Colleen got just by walking in a room. I did that to her. I planted that. And when Colleen died and I put Colleen's baby into Marlene's arms, I handed my grown daughter the one thing she could never survive. A little girl with her sister's face and her sister's eyes and her sister's laugh to raise under her own roof for the rest of her life. Every day you reminded her of the sister who beat her without even trying. Every time you laughed, she heard Colleen. Every time I drove over and held your face in my hands and lit up the way I never lit up for her, she watched me choose Colleen all over again, in Colleen's child. And she could not forgive you for a crime that was mine and Colleen's, and never, ever yours. That is why she was cold to you, my darling, not because you were unlovable. My God, you were the most loved child in that whole family, loved by your mother past all reason, loved by me until it broke something in your aunt. You were not too little to love. You were too much loved, by the wrong people, in front of a woman who'd been starving her whole life. The coldness in that house was never a verdict on your worth. It was the oldest jealousy in the world, and it landed on you. And you were only a baby, and it was never your fault. Do you hear me? It was never, ever your fault. I should have told you 100 times. I was a coward. I told myself the truth would only hurt you, when really I was afraid of what it would cost me. Marlene would have cut me off from you entirely, and I could not bear to lose the afternoons. So I kept your mother in a box on a closet shelf, and I let you grow up thinking the woman who couldn't love you was the whole story. That was wrong. You deserved your mother. So here she is. The photograph is her. That's Colleen, holding you in my garden, the spring you were born. The song is hers. Sing it to your own babies someday. And know that somewhere on the other side of all this, there is a young woman with your exact face who wanted you more than she wanted her own life, and who is furious, I promise you, that it took this long to get you home to her. You were always wanted, Bethany. You were always, always wanted. Live like it. All my love, forever and past forever, Nana. I got to the end and I could not see the page anymore. The kitchen was silent. Elliot had a hand pressed over his mouth. And across the table, my mother, my aunt, the woman who raised me, was folded over her own knees, making a sound I had never heard a human being make. A low animal keening, 29 years of something breaking loose all at once. I couldn't, she was saying, over and over into her lap. I couldn't look at you. I tried. God knows I tried. Every day you'd laugh in that kitchen with her voice, and I'd want to. I'd have to leave the room. She was gone, and there you were, laughing at me, being her, and everybody loved you the way they never. Her head came up. Her face was ruined. Do you know what it's like to lose to someone your whole life, and then have to raise the proof? To tuck it in at night? To sign its report cards? And here is the thing about that moment. I understood her. For the first time in my life, I completely understood my mother. And it did not make me love her. And it did not make me hate her. And it did not make me want to comfort her. It just made her make sense. She was a woman who'd been hungry for so long she'd started eating her own child. I did not scream. I did not throw the box. Everything in me had gone very still and very clear, the way it does, the way it always has. You were never really mine, I said quietly. She flinched. You said that to me at the dinner table 3 weeks before my wedding. You meant it as the cruelest thing you could reach for. I looked at her. But it was just true. I never was yours. I was hers. And you knew it every day, and you punished a child for it for 34 years. And you tore her face out of the only picture I had. And this morning you drove 90 miles in your nightgown. Not to say you were sorry, to keep me from finding out I was loved. Bethany, you could have told me any day for 29 years, I said. You could have handed me my mother. Instead, you handed me a Bible with her face torn out, and you hoped I'd never look inside. I stood up. I finally understand you, Marlene. I do. And I am never going to see you again. She got to her feet, swaying. And now that the crying had crested, the old thing came back into her. The granite, reaching for its footing. Because a woman like Marlene does not know how to be in a room without control of it, and she reached for the only lever she had left. After everything I did for you, she said, and her voice was hardening again, you're going to throw me away over a dead woman and a sick old lady's letter. Fine. But you remember this, Bethany. She left you. Colleen. She died and left you. I'm the one who stayed. Someday you'll see who your real mother was. The one who stayed. I looked at her for a long moment. My real mother, I said, sang me to sleep every night until the day her body failed her at 29. She didn't leave me. She was taken. You had 29 years and full health and a house with my name on the mail, and you're the one who left. Every single day. You just never had the decency to walk out the door. She had nothing. For the first time in her life, my mother had nothing to say to me. She stood in my kitchen in her nightgown and her thrown-on coat, and she looked suddenly like exactly what she was. An old woman who had spent her one life feeding a jealousy that ate her family down to the bone, and who was now going to be alone with it. Gerald knows I came here, she said finally, weakly, as if that meant anything. Gerald cried on the porch and handed my grandmother's box to my fiancé. I said, Gerald's done too. I think you're the last one to figure that out. She flinched a third time. And then she gathered the shreds of herself and she walked out of my house, and I watched from the window as she sat in her silver sedan in my driveway for a long time before she started the engine, her hands over her face, and then she backed out, crooked, one wheel bumping off the grass, and drove away into the morning. I never saw her again. That's not a figure of speech. I mean it exactly. She is called, through other people's phones and unknown numbers, and I have let every one of them ring out. There is nothing left in me that needs to pick up. That surprised me too. I thought there would be a pull. There isn't. She spent it all, over 34 years, one cold nod at a time, until the account was simply empty. You cannot withdraw from a bank you closed a long time ago. Elliot came and stood behind me at the window, and he wrapped his arms around me, and he put his chin on the top of my head, and for a while neither of us said anything. The sun came up the rest of the way, the kitchen filled with real light. She made me promise, he said quietly into my hair. Your grandmother, that day at Fairview. She held my face in her hands, She did it to me too, that thing she did to you. And she said, if that girl ever gets brave enough to leave, you go get the box before Marlene burns it. Don't let her die not knowing her mother loved her. I said I would. His arms tightened. I've been carrying it 2 years, Bethany. I sat at that engagement dinner and let your sister climb on my knee, and I didn't knock the table over because I knew what was coming. And I knew you had to walk out of that house on your own before you'd ever be able to walk toward this. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. It wasn't mine to tell. I turned around in his arms and I looked up at the least dramatic man I have ever loved, who drove 90 miles in the dark to keep a promise to a dead woman, and I finally understood the quiet on that porch, and the not yet, and the way he looked at me when I laughed. You should have been allowed to keep it, I said. My laugh. That's what you meant. It's hers, he said. It was always hers. And now you get to know that. Don't cry too hard for me yet, because the story isn't over. Finding out who your mother was is not the same as knowing her. I had a name now, and a face, and a song. I did not yet have her. And the next thing I did, the very next thing, was go looking for the woman in the yellow dress. I started with the apartment over the hardware store on Main Street, in the town where Colleen had raised me for 5 years I couldn't remember. The hardware store was still there. The apartment above it was rented to a young couple now, but the woman who ran the register downstairs had been there 40 years, and when I said the name Colleen Marsh, her face opened like a window. Colleen, she said. Lord, I haven't heard that name in... She looked at me harder. Then her hand went to her chest. You're the baby. You're little Bethany. My God, you're the spitting image. Her name was Ruth, and she made me a cup of coffee in the back room, and she told me about my mother. She told me Colleen used to bring me down to the store in a sling and prop me on the counter while she chatted, and that I'd laugh at the ceiling fan and the whole store would stop to watch. She told me Colleen worked 2 jobs and never once looked tired when she had me. She told me Colleen sang, everywhere, at the register, on the sidewalk, walking me in the stroller, and that there was one song, an old one, she sang more than any other. Something about a river, Ruth said, and my whole body went cold and warm at once. Hush now, little fish. Her daddy sang it to her. She sang it to you. Ruth's eyes filled. She'd have walked through fire for you, honey. When she passed, this whole town... She stopped and pressed her napkin to her mouth. It broke something in the whole town. Before I left, Ruth went into the back and came out with a shoebox soft at the corners. She'd kept it, she said, for 29 years, not knowing why, only that it felt wrong to throw away. Inside were a handful of things from the apartment upstairs that nobody had come to claim after Colleen died. A hair clip, a paperback with the spine broken open to a favorite page, a grocery list in my mother's round handwriting, and a single baby sock, impossibly small, that I understood without being told had been mine. Ruth pressed the box into my hands and closed my fingers around it. She'd want her girl to have her things, she said. Not that sister. You. I held that shoebox in my lap in the car for 20 minutes before I could see well enough to drive. I sat in the back of a hardware store and cried for a woman I was too young to remember, and it was the first grief of my life that felt clean. No confusion in it. No wondering what I'd done. Just the plain, enormous fact of a mother, and the plain, enormous fact of her being gone. Ruth told me where she was buried. The cemetery was small, at the edge of town, under old oaks. It took me 20 minutes to find her, because I didn't know what I was looking for, and because the stone was so modest. Flat, gray, half sunk into the grass. Nora had paid for it, I'd learn later. Marlene had refused to contribute $1. Colleen Ann Marsh, 1968 to 1997, she sang. 2 words under the dates. She sang. My grandmother chose those. I stood over my mother's grave, 34 years old in the July heat, and I understood that Nora had been trying to tell me the truth my whole life in the only ways she was allowed. In a drawer of saved drawings, in a hummed tune, in 2 words on a stone, in a letter she was too afraid to hand me and too loving not to write. I knelt down. I put my hand flat on the warm granite. And then I did the only thing I had to give her. I sang the song. I didn't know I knew it, but it turns out you can know something in your body that your mind was never allowed to keep. It came up out of me whole, every word, in a voice I'd spent my whole life being told to quiet. Hush now, little fish, the river runs wide. I sang it all the way through to my mother, at her grave, in the sun, and for the first time since I was 5 years old, nobody flinched. Nobody told me to stop. There was no one there to be wounded by the sound of me being loved. That was the day the wound closed. Not the day I found out. Not the day I read the letter. This one. The day I sang my mother's song over my mother's grave and finally believed all the way down the thing Nora spent a lifetime trying to tell me. That I was never the problem. That I had been loved so hard it broke the wrong people. That the coldness was the inheritance of jealousy I'd been handed to carry, and I could set it down now, in the grass, and walk away light. There were a few more truths that found me in the weeks after, the way truths do once the dam breaks. Gerald wrote me a letter, a real one, 3 pages, in his cramped little hand. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't ask to see me. He just told me he'd known since the beginning, that he'd wanted to tell me 100 times, that his silence was the great cowardice of his life, and that the sound of himself laughing at that dinner table was going to follow him to his grave. He said he understood if he never heard from me again. I didn't write back, but I kept the letter. There's a difference between forgiving someone and letting them off the hook, and I'm still learning where the line is. He, at least, told the truth at the end. That counts for something. It doesn't count for enough. Vanessa called, once, from her own number, 6 weeks later. I almost didn't answer, but I did, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "I didn't know. Bethany, I swear to God, I didn't know that we weren't." And she started to cry, and I realized something I hadn't expected. Vanessa had been handed a poison gift too. She'd been made the golden child, the weapon, the favorite. And it had grown her crooked into a woman who climbed onto her sister's fiancé's knee to feel powerful, because being the favorite was the only love she'd ever been taught. She wasn't innocent, but she was, in her own way, another kid raised in that house's terrible weather. We are not close. I don't know if we ever will be, but I don't hate her anymore. Hate takes energy I'd rather spend on people who look at me the way Nora did. And Marlene? Marlene got exactly what she built. Gerald moved into the spare room and then, that fall, into an apartment of his own. Vanessa keeps her distance now, too. It turns out being the favorite loses its shine the second you understand what it cost. My mother is alone in the yellow house on Wexler Street with the 2 temperatures, and now there's only one person left in it to be cold to, and that's herself. I didn't do that to her. She spent 34 years doing it. One nod at a time, and the bill finally came. That is not revenge. I never lifted a finger. It's just what's left when the jealousy finishes eating everything it was fed. I got the photograph framed. The whole one. Colleen in her yellow dress, holding me up to the light, both of us laughing. It hangs in my hallway now where I see it every morning. I look exactly like her. I used to hate my crooked eyebrow. Now it's the first thing I look for. There was one more person I needed to see. I drove out to Fairview and I found Dottie in the day room, 81 and sharp as a tack, working a crossword in pen. When I told her who I was, she set down the pen, and she looked at me over her glasses for a good long while. "So he did it," she said. The carpenter. He got the box. He got the box, I said. Dottie, you saved my life with one phone call. I don't know how to thank you. She waved that off like a fly. But her eyes were wet. She told me she'd sat with Nora in her last months, on the hard days and the clear ones, and that on the clear ones, Nora talked about only one thing. Her granddaughter, Dottie said. She was so afraid, honey. Afraid she'd die and you'd go your whole life thinking you weren't wanted. She used to grab my arm and say, Dottie, somebody has to tell her. Somebody has to tell her about Colleen. Dottie reached over and patted my hand, exactly the way Nora used to. She'd be glad. Wherever she is. She'd be so glad, you know. Before I left, Dottie told me one last thing, and it's the piece I hold closest of all. She said that on Nora's very last clear afternoon, the one where she made Elliot promise, Nora had him lean down close, and she sang him the river song, and she made him learn it. In case, Nora told him, in case that girl ever forgets the tune, you sing it back to her. An old dying woman teaching my mother's song to the man who'd marry me so that the sound of me being loved could never be fully lost again. Elliot never told me that part. I asked him about it in the car that night. He just shrugged, in his quiet way, and said, Didn't figure you'd need me to. Figured you had it in you the whole time. And I did. But I like knowing he learned it anyway. I like knowing that if I'd ever gone silent, there was a plan to bring the song back. We got married in the fall. Not in January, the way we'd planned, 3 weeks after a dinner that broke everything. We waited until October, when the oaks turned, and we did it small. Elliot and me, Dottie in the front row in a hat she bought special, Ruth from the hardware store, a few friends from the hospice, and the framed photograph of Colleen propped on a chair where a mother would sit. No one raised a glass to my replacement. No one laughed at me. The only laughing that day was the good kind, and I did most of it, in the voice my mother gave me, and not one person in that room flinched at the sound. When it came time to walk down the aisle, there was no one to give me away, in the old sense. My father wasn't there. I hadn't asked him. But I didn't walk alone either. I carried the photograph in my 2 hands, Colleen laughing up at the light, and I carried the letter folded in the bodice of my dress, over my heart, and I walked myself down that aisle held up by 2 women who were gone and had never once, not for a single day, stopped wanting me here. At the reception, Elliot pulled me aside, and instead of a first dance song from a speaker, he leaned in close, the way Nora made him practice, and quietly, just for me, he sang the river song. Hush now, little fish, the river runs wide. And I put my head on his shoulder in my white dress and I let the whole thing, 34 years of cold and 1 gray July morning, and a woman in a yellow dress I finally got to grieve. I let all of it go warm. I think about the version of me that walked into that dinner 3 weeks before the wedding, carrying hope in her hands, sure that something was wrong with her. I want to reach back through time and put my hand on her shoulder. I want to tell her the truth. Nora spent a lifetime trying to get to her. There was never anything wrong with you. You were the most loved child in that house. You were just loved by the wrong people in front of the wrong woman. And none of it. Not one cold nod, not one plate set down too hard, not one card under a coffee cup, was ever a verdict on your worth. It was somebody else's old hunger, and you were only ever a child, and you were always, always wanted. If you grew up as the one who got the nod instead of the kiss, if you've spent your life sure there was some rot in you that made the love skip past, I need you to hear this tonight, wherever you are. The coldness you were handed was never proof of what you're worth. It was proof of what was broken in the people who couldn't hold you. Go find your grandmother's box. Go find your mother's song. And if you've had to walk away from the people who were supposed to love you, in order to finally be loved right, tell me below. I want to know I'm not the only one who found the warm house on the other side of that door. My name is Bethany. My mother's name was Colleen. She sang. And every night now I sing her song into a house with only one temperature in it, and it is warm, all the way through, at last.